This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
We're very lucky today to have one of the most exciting and interesting and engaged scholars of new media who also uses and produces new media in the country. Professor Kathleen Fitzpatrick of Pomona College. This year she is on sabbatical, lucky lady, at NYU, which is where she also did her graduate work and where she works closely with NYU Press, both on a forthcoming book, which I'll talk about in just a second, and various projects, especially the Media Commons, which she is the co-founder and co-director of. A very, very interesting project, which I know she'll talk about in the question and answer period. I'm not sure if that'll be part of her talk today. Like many of the most forward-looking people in the humanities, instead of wringing her hands about, oh my gosh, everything's coming to an end, Kathleen is one of the people who feels like what we know as humanists is crucial to the age we live in, and she brings her training in the humanities to bear on some of the most pressing issues of how we communicate, how we write, how we read, how we interact, how we exchange our ideas, how we exchange friendships, how we make communities, how we make networks in the digital age. Kathleen's first book was called is that right? No. And The Anxiety of Obsolescence, the American novel in the age of television, and that came out in 2006 from Vanderbilt University Press. The new one, which we're all very excited about, is called Planned Obsolescence, Publishing, Technology, and the Future of the Academy. It's forthcoming in the fall from NYU Press, but it's also available right now on Media Commons. A draft is available for your review and perusal on Media Commons. She is a scholar who brilliantly practices what she preaches. And one of the things I think we're going to hear about today is this new world of authorship that isn't just about me or you, but about us writing together. And she does that in her own writing and promotes it on her blogs, on her very active Twitter feed, and in many other ways. So please join me in welcoming, I would say, one of the most important people in our country for thinking through the new roles of authorship and publishing. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That's really overwhelming, and I hope I live up to it. I'm really very happy to be here. I just want to thank the folks at Haystack and at the Franklin Humanities Center for having me here today and giving me this opportunity to talk with all of you about the future of authorship. The talk is really thinking about the ways that new digital modes of communication will change the kinds of writing and the ways of writing that many of us will end up doing in the coming years. And it's not simply that we're going to forget how to capitalize. But I will start with two epigraphs. The first from Sir Isaac Newton. If I have seen further, it is only by standing on the shoulders of giants. And secondly, from Michel Foucault. While all of this is familiar in philosophy, as in literary criticism, I am not certain that the consequences derived from the disappearance or death of the author have been fully explored or that the importance of this event has been appreciated. Now, this talk does draw fairly heavily upon the forthcoming book that Kathy mentioned, the draft of which is available at this URL, and I'll be happy to give you that again later in the Q&A in the event that you miss it. The overall focus of this book is less the technological changes that are arguably going to be required in order to support the digital scholarly future than it is the social, intellectual, and institutional changes that those kinds of technological change will require of all of us within the academy in various ways. And these transformations, I argue in the book, are going to bear significant implications for our thinking about the nature of authorship, in particular about ourselves as authors, as the profoundly collaborative dialogic structures of the web are really not a natural fit with many of the profoundly individualist assumptions that we make about what it is to be an author, and particularly a scholarly author, and particularly a scholarly author within the humanities tradition, right? For us, writing is something that we must undertake and be evaluated upon alone. Right. So it's perhaps not surprising that writing produces a host of anxieties for many authors, anxiety being the other word that pops up in my work along with obsolescence a whole lot. And I would include in that group of authors for whom writing can be an anxious process many very well established, successfully published professors, right? We have lots of anxieties about originality, for instance, about creativity, about productivity, and about ownership, among other things. You know, if you have a hard time imagining these anxieties and how they manifest in the lives of writers, all you need to look at are the plethora of self-help books for writers that are out there. Such as The Productive Writer, Tips and Tools to Help You Write More, Stress Less, and Create Success, which is obviously aimed at the general author, right? But this genre extends to scholarly authors as well, of course, and so we end up with titles like Academic Writing for Graduate Students, Writing Your Dissertation in 15 Minutes a Day, and then, of course, William Germano's famous From Dissertation to Book, and his earlier book, Getting It Published, highlighting one of the places where that anxiety arises, and also now out in a second edition, so the anxiety continues, right? And of course, there's Beth Lewis's Handbook for Academic Authors, and Robert Boyce's Professors as Writers, not to mention Paul Sylvia's entirely on the nose How to Write a Lot, right? Now, none of these books would exist if we weren't deeply worried about writing, about how much of it we do, about how we fit it into the rest of our careers, and so forth. But these books also all suggest that though we can learn from their examples, solving our writing problems is something that we all have to do alone, right? If perhaps in solitary consultation with an authority on the subject. I mean, the fact is, though, that reading is itself becoming an increasingly social process online, and new spaces for social reading are making the line between reading and writing somewhat blurry, right, as they highlight the degree to which writing originates in responding to other texts and in discussion with other readers. So it's my suggestion in this talk that focusing on the social aspects of reading and writing might help us find greater pleasure in writing and might help assuage some of the anxieties that these self-help texts are attempting to address. But that these kinds of changes in thinking about the social will require questioning many of our assumptions about authorship and how those assumptions impose themselves on our writing lives. Now, there is a mild irony in my suggestion that we need to rethink the nature of authorship, as it at times seems, at least from a certain perspective, that literary studies has done little other than question the nature of the author for the last 4 decades or so. But the ways that we've been thinking about authorship have been, in a most literal sense, theoretical, right? Scholars have, for instance, explored the historical linkages among the rise of capitalism, the dominance of individualism, and the conventional figure of the author, often at great length. But we haven't generally considered those issues with respect to our own authorship practices. And I would argue that this kind of self-examination is really necessary for any productive change to take place in the ways that we work. But it's clear that one way or another, that change is coming. Well, in fact, change has already come, in fact, to many of the ways that scholars and writers, other writers work today, as much of that work that we do is being done digitally already. It's just that in many cases, we're retrofitting our digital technologies to be print analogs in some sense, right? Witness the dominance of the PDF, making something look as though it could be printed or might even once upon a time have been printed, creates a sense of legitimacy for that digital text. Now, truly digital work, right, work that doesn't necessarily have to have that print analog, is beginning to appear. But we need to take a look at the ways that this kind of work will undoubtedly disturb our assumptions about what it is that we're doing as we're writing. New digital modes of publishing, if genuinely embraced, will require us to think very differently about authorship. Now, this is not to say that computers will make us write differently or think differently. Our technologies really don't determine how we behave. But technologies and cultures are mutually determining, a relationship that I think bears closer examination. So take, for example, the word processor. In the not too very distant past, though a past that few of you, I suspect, will remember at this point, many professors and other authors had secretaries, right? Or perhaps typists, or at the very least, wives, who handled a key aspect of their work, right? But over the last 3 decades, a series of technological and social changes have made this phenomenon all but unheard of, right? With very few exceptions, everybody operates his or even her own word processor, right? So the result of this is that typing is no longer a purely technological process that follows the intellectual act of writing, right? Allowing it to be outsourced, but rather is now at the core of the writing process itself, right? So rather than, as I did in college, writing out an entire paper in longhand and then laboriously typing it up only when it seemed done, and then discovering when you missed that footnote on page 2 that you have to go back and retype the entire thing from scratch, right? We now instead write and rewrite as we type, right? Moving pieces around, deleting, inserting, revising, all in midstream. So the word processor allows us to focus much more on process, right? Allowing our writing to become more recursive, more nonlinear, more open-ended, more spontaneous than previous technologies allowed. Similarly, I would argue the technologies of the web, from the transmission control protocol that governs internet traffic, through the HTTP and HTML protocols of the World Wide Web, through the structures of the graphical browser, all of these are designed to promote the open exchange of data in a content-agnostic fashion. And this is not accidental. The end-to-end design of computer networks give them a kind of neutrality in the communication process, right? The network treats any packet of data like any other, leaving it to the applications at either end to determine how that data should be interpreted. Now, this is not to say, of course, that that situation couldn't change. I mean, net neutrality, as we've seen over the last few years, can be undermined by those who control the network in between if they rewrite the protocols under which they operate for their own purposes. And one can imagine why they might want to rewrite those protocols, right? The openness that has been the ethos of the web, that's been written into its code at the most fundamental level, has had a direct impact on many information industries, which are being forced to reinvent their business models as a result. One might, of course, see the music industry as well as the newspaper industry, and even more recently the magazine industry, which is now starting to grapple with Apple's restrictions on in-app subscriptions, and coming soon to major piracy near you, the book publishing industry, right? Book publishers are struggling in vain to find the perfect combination of devices and DRM that will prevent them from having to change their basic business model. But looking at those other industries, they should know by now that no such solution will last. So content providers of all kinds really need to think about new ways of working with rather than against those dominant communication channels. And that includes the academy. We really need to rethink our own information sharing practices in higher education as we move more and more of our communication onto the web. But I do want to suggest that the changes that are upon us, the changes that I'm talking about today, are really not, in fact, radical alterations in the nature of authorship, but instead a kind of acknowledgement of things that have lingered beneath the surface of our writing practices all along, remnants of authorship's peculiar history. So rather than setting out to disrupt all of our notions of authorship, what it is, how it functions, what I'm hoping is that we can look at our practices from a slightly different perspective. First and foremost, I want us to reconsider what it is that all authors are doing as we're writing, engaging in a kind of conversation with our readers, with our predecessors, with our peers, even if that conversation is at times conducted at a glacially slow pace. Now, returning to this sense of conversation as the focus of our writing practices will enable a richer sense of the audiences that we're addressing as we write, as well as the multiple forms in which those audiences can be addressed. The key issue ultimately is interaction, right? The author does not operate, and in fact has never operated in a vacuum, but has always been a participant in ongoing multi-voice dialogue. That these conversations can now take place in forms that some traditional authors find alarming should not prevent us from exploring the ways that those forms can help advance knowledge. In fact, facing those fears head on might in fact reveal that we're afraid of the wrong thing. So I would suggest that Howard Block and Carla Hess in an introduction to an edited collection on future libraries, actually just miss the mark when they suggest in this essay that our concerns about our loss of the notion of the author is part of a larger fear of the loss of community. In fact, I would argue the dominant loss that's expressed here is that of individuality, right? It's revealing the assumption that coherent imagined selves require separation from one another rather than interconnection in order to be thought coherent. And that the disordering of authorial agency in favor of an increasingly active reader is a disruption of authority rather than simply a changing relationship. And this, finally, is what we've got to consider, right? Where does the authority in authorship lie? And does it rest in the same characteristics online as it does in print? Now, authorship as we understand it today is a relatively recent invention. Early books were considered the product of a guild rather than an individual. And the values that we associate with print authorship, and especially with book authorship, for instance, individuality, originality, completeness, and ownership, are not a direct product of those technologies, nor in fact were they the proximate cause of the development of those technologies. But instead, the technology of print and the concept of authorship that we associate with it each grew out of distinct but related historical formations that affected the breadth of Western political, social, and economic structures at a particular moment in history. So this runs contrary to a lot of the assumptions about the determining force of print culture that have been made popular by Marshall McLuhan's The Gutenberg Galaxy, for instance, and following on McLuhan, Elizabeth Eisenstein's The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, both of which argue for a culture that was radically shaped by, if not brought into existence entirely, by print itself. However, as Adrian Johns has noted, the assumptions that we carry about print's authority were not always self-evident, right? They were not born at the same moment that print was, and in fact were brought into being alongside and through a difficult process alongside print technologies. Establishing the authority of print was, in this sense, a social rather than a technological process, right? One that had as much to do with late 18th century political change as it did print itself. So the assumptions that we bear today about the author, that the author is a unitary voice expressing original ideas in a complete and polished form over which he retains legal property rights, derive less from the technologies and the processes that produce the author's texts and more from the legislative and economic systems that govern those technologies and processes. And the implications of this for our own sense of authorship are profound. I mean, if in part our attachments to the ideas of authorship that we bear arise from deeply seated beliefs about the locus of individual intelligence and about the placement of the individual within liberal society, we might recognize a certain conflict, for instance, between that notion of authorship and the more communally oriented ideals of academic life. Now, of course, critiques of the ideological assumption behind authorship have been underway since the late 1960s. Most famous of these, of course, is Roland Barthes' 1967 essay announcing the death of the author, which seeks to undermine the critical and political authority that has been invested in that figure, in part by insisting upon the structuring power of language over the subject, right? Such that it becomes impossible for any author to fully control the text that he or she produces. The author is not, as Barthes says, the subject of which his writing is predicate, but is rather born subject to the process of writing itself. And if anything, the function of the author for Barthes, and even more importantly, of the critical attribution of authorship, is not to provide a text with meaning, but rather to close meaning down. Right? The author puts a full stop to the interpretive process. Once we know what it is he meant, there is no more to be said. Hence Barthes' assertion that the birth of the reader must be requited by the death of the author. In order to give full credence to the reader's part in the meaning-making process, the author with a capital A must be shunted aside. Sure, right? As good post-structuralists, or by this hour of the world, post-structuralists, we can hear this and nod, yes, of course. The death of the author, a moment of radical empowerment for us as we can finally overcome the intentional fallacy and ignore the author and focus instead on producing more imaginative new readings of the texts with which we work. Sure. But, and one almost hesitates to ask, what does this death of the author bode for us, for instance. If the author is dead, how can scholars continue to think of writing as part of our work? And how can we continue to evaluate the careers of academics based upon their writing? Now, Foucault provides a partial answer, if not a particularly reassuring one, in his 1969 rejoinder, What is an Author? In contrast to Barthes' sense of the liberatory effects of the author's death that might be produced for the reader, Foucault instead suggests that though the author is dead, the networks of power that produce cultural authority remain fully in place. Sure, the author may have been demoted to the status of the author function, right? A projection, he says, of our way of handling texts. The role of the author function for Foucault is no more than to characterize the existence, circulation, and operation of certain discourses within a society, which is to say that the author becomes a kind of convenient handle by which to pick texts up and carry them around. At one and the same time, something significantly less than the independent liberal actors we like to imagine ourselves to be as writers, and something more insidious, right? The figure that controls access to those ideas. Now, if we are indeed operating in a post-author era, as Foucault finally suggests at the end of the essay, to what extent has this theoretical death of the author or rise of the author function actually affected the production of texts? Well, early theorists of hypertext argued that this digital form made manifest the post-structuralist decentering of the author, the fragmentation of the text, and the activation of the reader. And yet, hypertext itself did not produce the hoped-for revolution in authoring practices. In fact, I make the argument in the full version of this text that, if anything, hypertext is in its way peculiarly even more determined than is the book, and that the experience of reading hypertext can at times seem more focused on the attempt to divine the author's encoded intent than on creating a reader-centered experience. And in fact, our actual authorship practices seem to be caught between two regimes. On the one hand, bound to assumptions about the ownership and originality of texts that derive from older Enlightenment-era notions of the self, while at the same time using technologies that lend themselves to the distributed, the collective, the process-oriented, the anonymous, and the remix. Now, that the digital has already had significant effects on our work, both in terms of the ways that we write and in terms of the ways that our writing moves throughout the academy and the broader public sphere, is true. But a full acknowledgement of the benefits that these digital authorship practices might present for our writing will require a significant shift in our thinking about ourselves as engaged in this writing process, right? What it is we're doing, how and with whom we're doing it, and the relationship between ourselves and the texts that we produce. And the first of the shifts that I want to talk about in this regard has to do with the status of the texts themselves that we're producing as we write. As scholarly authors, we're very attuned to the shape of traditional forms like the book or the journal article, and we have a very good sense of when those texts are complete. Right? But the web has begun to produce a range of new forms that don't comfortably fit those older structures. The blog, for instance, its focus on the development of an author and her ideas over time, its emphasis on comments from the reading community, its heavy reliance on links to other blog discussions. All of these aspects together produce texts that are no longer discrete or static in the same way that the book and the journal article have been, but that instead live and develop as part of a network of other such texts, among which ideas flow. So there are several aspects of these kinds of textual structures that depart from our expectations for traditional texts. I mean, generally, we expect texts to be complete and static rather than ongoing and developing. This stability is really closely associated with a text's authority. But there's another factor here that places pressure on completion as the most significant moment in the writing process, particularly for academic authors, because it's only at the moment of completion, after all, that our projects can attain their final purpose. Credit for completing an assignment or for the entry of a new item on the CV. This emphasis on the academic bottom line, right? The evidence of scholarly productivity that is required to obtain and maintain a professorial appointment brings a distinctly Fordist functionalist mode of thinking to our work as authors. If writing has in fact been reduced from a process of discovery and exploration to a system for the assembly of more and more new products, and if the result is, as Lindsay Waters has claimed, that many scholars feel more and more like the figure portrayed by Charlie Chaplin in the film Modern Times, madly and insensibly working to produce, it is little wonder that many of us experience unresolved anxieties about our writing. But in some sense, being done with a project published online runs counter to the network's open-endedness. I mean, what made blogs so popular so quickly was precisely the way that they developed over time. Right? That readers return again and again to find out if there are new posts. I mean, indeed, that we've developed technologies that will alert us when those new posts arrive, indicates that there's something in the structure of engagement with texts online that privileges and encourages development and change. Now, we don't know yet what the readers of the future will expect when it comes to updating published work online, but it seems obvious, given that malleability is one of the chief characteristics of online text, that attempting to replicate the permanence of print online makes little sense. Now, this is not to say that there should be no permanence in the online record. Allowing a text to grow and change over time needn't efface earlier stages if we can employ robust versioning, right, which can allow a text to live and breathe while still maintaining snapshots of the text at key moments of development. Now, admittedly, this sort of change is very likely to make a lot of authors nervous. Many of us already have difficulty completing projects, and if we have the opportunity to continue working on something forever, we just might. But on some level, one has to wonder if that would necessarily be such a bad thing. If we were freed, and it would have to be by a necessary shift in the ways that we credit ongoing and in-process work, if we were freed to shift our attention away from publication as the moment of singularity in which a text transforms from nothing into something, and instead focus on the many important stages in our work's coming into being, we might be able to think about this process a bit differently. I mean, what if we were able to think of our careers as writers in a more holistic sense, right, as an ongoing process of development, perhaps with some key moments of punctuation, rather than solely as a discrete set of closed projects. It's possible that this kind of shift would lead to work that was better thought through, more significant in some sense. But it's clear that first we have to learn to value process over product, right? That we have to manifest that value of process in our assessments of one another's work. But the relationship of others to our own work is another point of anxiety for traditional intellectuals in contemplating new modes of digital authorship. I mean, in fact, our understanding of authorship is in part contingent on the separation between the person who wrote the text and the person who might read it. The name of the author that gets printed on the text serves as a kind of contract, assuring us of its provenance, right? But the interconnections among texts and authors online render some of those separations fuzzy, leading us to ask how the multivocality, the multi-voicedness of online texts will transform our sense of authority. It's also, and not incidentally, a question about how we can be given credit for, again, or perhaps held accountable for our work when our texts form part of this larger network, when other authors' responses appear within the same frame as our own writing. Now, these concerns will, of course, be most pronounced in areas in which single authorship remains the norm. Within the academy, that's a small number of fields, primarily within the humanities. Multiple authorship has, in fact, been the norm for quite a while in many of the natural and social sciences, as it is in the production of most media other than print, such as film and video, for instance. And the large-scale kinds of projects that are being undertaken in the digital humanities often necessitate collaboration among multiple researchers in order to come to fruition. As these new kinds of projects become increasingly prevalent in contemporary culture, we're going to be required to rethink the ways that we give credit for this sort of work. Many scholars in the humanities contemporarily, at least, report having difficulty in getting co-authored publications taken seriously as part of their record of production. But beyond this, even this kind of obviously collaborative endeavor, co-authoring, it would do us some good to reconsider the individualism that with which we approach our authorship, even with respect to those projects for which we would rightly consider ourselves sole authors. There are ways in which our work has always been collaborative, and our texts have always been multi-voiced, relying on, as we do, on the work that's gone before us and on the comments that have been provided by our peer reviewers. And foregrounding these relationships, this kind of discussion, will be inevitable in network-based publishing, as other authors' words will literally connect to our own through links. But already today, the work that appears to take place in isolation is finding itself part of a fundamentally social process, as each author is always writing with and against the work of others. So what I'm calling for in shifting our thinking about authorship from individualism to collaboration is less radical than it might initially sound. Not an abandonment of what we might think of as the single author text, but instead an awareness that that text has always been part of an ongoing conversation, both with those whom we have read and those who will read us. An open exchange that in the end cannot help but be collaborative. But as we consider the movement of texts and ideas across what previously seemed firmly delineated authorial boundaries, concerns about originality are likely to surface. I mean, after all, the assertion that our work is our own must mean that it is uniquely our own, cordoned off from the ideas of others by quotation marks, for instance, or citations. However, if the boundaries around our texts begin to become fuzzy because of their networked nature, so too become the boundaries of our ideas, around our ideas. I mean, how do we demarcate the thing that constitutes our own contribution to the discourse? How can our texts possibly remain unique, discrete, original in an environment so thoroughly determined by the copy? Our anxiety about originality in our writing has to do with the dangers that are presented by its potential failure, especially, of course, plagiarism. As scholars, we are permitted to interact with the texts of others only in a passive, clearly designated fashion, and by extension, others can only interact with our texts in a similar fashion. But as the dominant mode of text delivery shifts from the read-only structure of print to the read-write structure of digital technologies, can this assumption of uniqueness and the pressures toward pure originality continue to make sense? Now, of course, the kind of closed text that I'm describing has not always been the norm. In other eras, modes of textual production such as the compilation, the miscellany, and the commentary have been popular, and even the dominant form at times that authorship has taken. There have been eras in which originality was considered not a virtue but a danger to be avoided. And so I'm not suggesting that we live in that kind of era today, but I do want to insist that we no longer inhabit a world in which originality reigns unchallenged. Roland Barthes, back in 1967 again, understood that every text was a fabric of quotations. And similarly, Julia Kristeva, at about the same point, her exploration of intertextuality has shown us the degree to which even the most ostensibly original of texts always owes debts elsewhere. And of course, the growing importance of remix culture has profoundly affected many threads of online discourse. So the question is whether such remix culture might fruitfully influence our own authorship practices. And it's possible, given the dramatically increasing number of texts that are already in circulation online, that the kinds of work that we currently associate with curation, for instance, might become some of the most important forms of new scholarship, bringing together multiple threads of discourse that actually originate elsewhere. Now, this form of scholarly remix might look a little bit like blogging did in its original form, finding the best of what's happening on the web and bringing it together with commentary for one's readership. But it also might resemble a post hoc mode of journal or volume editing, creating playlists of sorts that juxtapose texts on the web in ways that produce new kinds of interrelationships and analyses among them. Now, the trick, as always, will be convincing ourselves that this mode of work should be allowed to count as creative and scholarly production, a shift that's going to require letting go of some aspects of our obsession with originality. But this kind of scholarly remix also raises some serious questions about the ownership of texts and ideas and its relationship to our authorship practices. Several recent studies on the history of copyright and intellectual property have demonstrated that there has been a dramatic shift in the function of those laws over time. The original reasoning behind them was the assumption that reserving to creators the right to benefit financially from their labor would encourage new invention and production. And in fact, treating intellectual work as property has come through the defense of copyright to seem a sort of prerequisite for new production. I mean, why would anyone innovate if they couldn't benefit from the results of their work? However, over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, copyright has increasingly come to be assigned not to individuals but to corporations, rather than being retained by those whom the principle was meant to support. And this assignment of copyright to corporations arguably made sense when those corporations had a lock on the only means of getting one's work into circulation. But now that production has become affordable, in theory, all one need do is straighten out the distribution channels, right? And then the author can have direct access to the audience, with more of the profits going directly to the artist, or at least, again, so the theory goes. A number of musicians have experimented of late with new models of distribution, including, of course, most famously Radiohead, who released In Rainbows as a pay-what-you-will download in 2007. As it turned out, 62% of downloaders paid nothing for the music, but the other 38% paid an average of $6 for the album. And these statistics led a number of publications, including most notably Fortune magazine, to declare the experiment a failure. Fortune included it as number 59 in their list of the 101 dumbest moments in business. But what Fortune failed to do here, oddly enough, was the math. More than 2 million people downloaded the album through the pay-what-you-will system, and at an average of $6 for 38% of those downloads, the album would have produced $4.5 million in revenue, which should, of course, be compared with the $1 per album sold royalties that Radiohead would have earned through their label, right? And you can begin to see that, at least in theory, they could have doubled their earnings here. So gradually, musicians are beginning to realize that they can paradoxically earn more from their work by giving it away, rather than jealously guarding it, or allowing a corporation, in fact, to jealously guard it. Okay, 3 things. First of all, only a band of the stature of Radiohead could have pulled this off. Secondly, very, very few writers have that stature. And third, almost none of those Radiohead-like writers are scholars. On the other hand, right, scholars are already in a very attenuated relationship to the original purposes of copyright, one that might shed light on a way of rethinking the relationship between writing and the marketplace. I mean, only a very rare scholar earns more than a pittance on the sale of her writing. Our incentives and rewards are far more indirect, right? Academic positions, promotions, lecture invitations, and the like. And those benefits come when our work is as widely known as possible. So it would seem then that self-interest for scholars would lie not in clinging ferociously to our own intellectual property, but instead in giving it away. And in fact, clinging to a principle that's designed for the marketplace when our own mode of exchange doesn't adhere to marketplace values seems beside the point. In fact, the mode of exchange that best suits academic culture is arguably the gift economy, right? We generally do our research and writing as a means of contributing to the general advancement of knowledge within the academy. And given that ethos, giving our work away in a manner that acknowledges that its primary purpose is to be reused and repurposed, right? Separating our notions of authorship from their associations with ownership will enable us to think about more productive ways of sharing our work with the people who we really want to read it, finally contributing to a richer, more vibrant scholarly community. While the same ethos might not apply to all writers, it seems evident that making more work freely available to more readers can only increase opportunities for new kinds of interactions between authors and readers, suggesting that a shift from thinking solely about authorship to thinking about sharing might help more writers, and particularly young writers, find the audience that they're seeking. Now, throughout this talk, I've focused on the ways that a shift to networked publishing environments will require us to think differently about authorship. But I haven't talked much about changes in the structures of writing itself. And it's obvious that the expansion in our tool set that's provided by the digital will allow us to shift our thinking from a uniform focus on the text-only formats that publishing has traditionally taken, encouraging us to think about the ways that our writing might interact with and include and, in fact, be something more than text. Now, this is not to say that everyone should be making YouTube videos instead of making arguments, or writing code instead of writing essays, necessarily. But it is to say that continuing to focus our attention on the production of digital texts that can be translated in whatever impoverished way into print will keep the range of our potential innovation quite narrow. And the main thing that I hope that this talk does is to encourage that innovation. In the meeting that I had with my dean in the months after I had received tenure at Pomona, in which we talked about the results of the review process and discussed my future plans, he told me that he hoped for nothing more than that my next project would startle him, that he wouldn't at first know how to understand it. And this is what I hope for from future authors, both scholarly and creative, that their work might startle me, that it might undo all of my own expectations about what is possible for the author today. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic.
Thank you, Kathy.
Wow, what an amazing audience. I hadn't turned around. This is incredible. We have 15 minutes for questions, and then for people who came late, I wanted to mention that Kathleen is going to stay around, and my second class, 21st Century Literacies, has been preparing materials, some of which is available on the Haystack site, about authorship and peer review, and they're going to be having a conversation with Kathleen after. Anyone who's here is welcome to stay for that extended conversation this afternoon. But in the meantime, questions for Kathleen. And you have to talk into this, right? Because it's being recorded.
I have some difficulties with the idea that documents, authorial documents, don't have an end. Because if we are having a conversation, I kind of expect the person I'm having the conversation with to say something and I react to it. And what if, while I'm reacting, they're having another conversation? So I'm not sure how to deal with that.
Yeah, well, it's less that it doesn't have an end. I mean, it might have pauses, appropriate moments of pause that allow for response and reflection and full exchange. I mean, what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about shifting from the static product to a greater emphasis on process is not leaving the product behind entirely, but instead thinking about the ways that an idea might develop and shift and change over time rather than simply kind of coming out as an article and stopping at that point. And in the fuller version of this, I talk some about the experience that I had of writing this book that is coming out in September. It started as this series of blog posts in which, frankly, I was just spouting off about issues in contemporary academic publishing. And I got a lot of back and forth with commenters on those blog posts that made me stop and reconsider and write some more blog posts that then made me produce a conference paper that then I published online, that then I got more response to, that then turned into an article that I also published online and got further response to, and all of that gradually sort of developed into the book. And there was something very, very valuable for me in making at least certain moments of that process visible. Now, I don't think that we need to let every moment of our process be visible, but I think that if we can start thinking about how that process might be of value to us, we can start to make things visible a little sooner in the process, perhaps at the conference paper stage, get more kinds of response and actually develop more thoughtful work in the end, right? I also do want to say that there is a moment at which the author is going to want to say, I am done with this idea. Right? I am walking away. I have another idea that I now want to pursue. A lot of the texts that I've published online, after a certain point, they haven't continued to get comments. So it's possible for me to kind of leave things hanging there and move on to the next thing. that it's there as part of my process doesn't mean I have to attend to it at every moment. But if someone did come along at this point and comment on something that I had published last year online, I would feel a certain obligation to at least engage with that comment and to acknowledge it. It's not an overwhelming burden, I think, and it keeps the work alive and ultimately produces those new ideas that will produce the next text. So, a less radical shift than it might sound at first.
Other question?
Hi, thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
Can you talk about your deal with NYU and
Yes.
the publication of your current book?
Yes. So I had gone to NYU with a proposal for the book Planned Obsolescence that was going to be a book, but I said in the proposal, I really want to, sort of practice what I'm preaching in the book and actually put the thing out there online and use some sort of modified open peer review process and see what comes of this. And NYU was at first a bit taken aback by this idea, as a press should be, right? This is a very odd way of working, and if, it has yet to be proven that giving things away in the academic universe produces greater sales, but there are indications that it actually might be so. So after a little bit of back and forth, and ultimately the argument that it was very likely going to be true that the audience for the online version of the text was not going to be the same audience as for the print version of the text, that the folks who would want to read it in print might not be willing to sit through the online version. That they sort of recognized that we're addressing two different groups, folks who are already in digital publishing spaces, folks who are trying to figure out what's going on in new digital publishing spaces. NYU was very excited about it. So in September-October 2009, we put the entire text as it existed at that point online in CommentPress, which is a WordPress plugin that allows for commenting on a text at a range of granularities. You can comment on the entire text, on it page by page, or on it paragraph by paragraph. And I opened it up for comment and open peer review. I had 40 commenters-ish produce something like 300 comments on the text. And it was not a perfect process, right? There are parts of the text that got less attention than other parts. Early parts of the text, interestingly, more comments, right? As you go further, they sort of decline. On the other hand, the text was also sent out by NYU for traditional blind peer review as well. And I got 2 really excellent readers' reports. But having 40 sets of eyes on the text as opposed to 2 sets of eyes, and 40 sets of eyes that were in communication with one another and not just with me, produced some really interesting effects. I mean, there are some points in the comments on the text at which reviewers utterly disagree with one another and sort of argue back, I don't think she should change that at all. I think that the thing that she's arguing here is this. And seeing where those points of contention lay were really interesting. So that was all back September-October 2009. The print object will be available, I believe, in September 2011. Right, and this is another one of those things that the digital sort of helps us to think about, is the slowness of these processes. The day that I turned the final manuscript in, there was an enormous report on the future of digital publishing that was released that, of course, I haven't dealt with in the manuscript now, right? So the book, in some sense, is going to be out of date by the time it comes out. So we're already thinking about what kind of digital apparatus is going to need to surround the physical book in order to keep it valuable as time goes forward.
Hi, I'm thinking about the role of the bibliography in traditional scholarship, and I wonder, going forward in this more disaggregated writing world, do you think that the bibliography will remain important in terms of tracking influences and relationships between ideas? And what would that look like?
I think there are a range of bibliographic-like metrics that I think we're going to find ourselves drawing upon more and more to sort of get a sense of where in the network of discourse a particular text lies, to see not just in terms of citations, but in other formats too, what the influence of that text has been. it's not something that's quite as easily quantified as citations are, right? Particularly within the sciences, the ISI impact factor of journals is entirely determined by the number of citations. That, you know, citation counts become incredibly important for scientists as they are reviewed within the academy and so forth. And I don't want to suggest that we're going to have more beans that we can count in order to produce a sense of a numerical value that determines a text's importance. But we are going to have things like not just the number of comments that a text has received, but who those commenters are. Not just the links that are inbound from other spots on the network, but what the relative significance of those links are. You know, are they just a passing reference, or is this in fact a real dialogue between those texts? I mean, we're going to have a lot more qualitative data that we can work with in terms of thinking about what the role of a text within its discourse network is. But determining how to make use of that data is going to be, I think, one of the next real challenges for the academy. That, you know, we like to have easy markers of quality. And actually reading and analyzing those connections will present challenges for review as we go forward.
Could you elaborate your idea slightly more in relation to or in comparison with the notion of open source that seems to be advancing quite rapidly in the realm of science and facing rather greater resistance among humanities?
Absolutely. Open source or open access, both? They're slightly different. Okay. Okay. Trying to figure out how to begin. So starting with open access, the principle behind open access is that, particularly, and this began with the sciences, as more and more commercial publishers got a lock on scientific journals and began basically extorting university libraries in selling the work of their own faculty back to them. It became increasingly important for a number of scientists to find ways to get their material out unencumbered by those corporate structures, to make sure that not only their university, but also universities in parts of the world, developing parts of the world that don't have access to full libraries, in schools and poorer communities that similarly don't have that kind of access, would be able to get to this material. And so they've been developing a series of open access initiatives that are attempting to get that work out there in ways that aren't hindered by pay models necessarily. There are a couple of different modes that this is taken. One is the institutional repository, which I understand there is an initiative for here, in which faculty are encouraged to deposit materials that can then be made available freely on the web. Often pre-publication materials rather than the actual final version of the article as it comes out. There are also an increasing number of open access venues for publication themselves, both journals and a couple of open access presses that are developing, that are really privileging open distribution of the results of research, open publication rather than closed publication. Some of those venues require, well, how to put this, heavy page charges that accrue to the author. This is the author pays model of publication, which is particularly prevalent in the sciences, where there are large grants that are underwriting most publishing projects, and those publishing costs just get written into the grants, no problem. In the humanities, this is a serious problem. The vast majority of humanities research is conducted without grant funding, and what grant funding there is usually so minuscule as not to be able to include charges for publication. So there are a number of open access journals in the humanities that are developing that are not author pays at all. They're basically running on volunteer labor and the goodness of the hearts of the people who participate in them. And yet those open access journals are finding that they're having a great, great impact precisely because the work that they're publishing can be circulated so broadly. So open access, getting things out. Open source is a slightly different issue in terms of the development of projects as community-based contributions, right? That a project releases its code to the world so that other people can continue to develop that code. The assumption behind that usually being that, and this comes out of the software world, obviously, that if you have contributed to an open source project, you're doing it in order to make the project better, right? That it's a kind of altruism, but an altruism that's determined by your desire to have a better tool, right? That I want this thing to work slightly differently. I will therefore contribute my time and labor to it. And arguably, that's how all scholarship operates. I mean, at least from a certain perspective, I am contributing my knowledge to science precisely because I want there to be better science. And therefore, that open source ethos, while it's slightly different from the ways that the academy functions, it might be something that's very useful for us to think about. There's some really great work going on in anthropology, most notably Chris Kelty, thinking about the ways that the ethos of free and open source software movements might helpfully reflect back on what it is we're doing in the academy and why we're doing it.
1 o'clock and the machines all close down at 1, is that correct? So what we've promised Kathleen is she can have a brief, we will all take a brief bio break, come back and have another informal discussion that will go on this afternoon led by students in the 21st Century Literacies class. Kathleen, thank you so much for an incredible conversation.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you all, and feel free to stay.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.